Okay, yeah. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, curious minds. It is my pleasure to welcome you at this special place here in Darmstadt, where we are going to explore the impact of artificial cold to our culture and everyday life, guided by an extraordinary researcher and storyteller. I'm delighted to welcome Nicola Twilley today, who has traveled all the way from hot Los Angeles to this old ice cellar here in Darmstadt to share with us her insights from more than a century of research into what she has called the planetary coldscape or the artificial cryosphere. In her new book, Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food and Our Planet and Ourselves, released by Penguin Press in June 24, Nicola delves deep into the chilling yet transformative power of refrigeration and how it has profoundly changed our life during the last 150 years. Those who read this book can not only enjoy an exemplary work of outstanding science journalism, but also gain insight into why rethinking our relationship to artificial cold will be one of the primary global challenges of this century. Nicola also co-authored a book on the history and future of quarantine, which has been hailed as one of the best books in 2021 by Time Magazine, The Guardian, and Financial Times, and as a contributing writer at The New Yorker and author of Edible Geography, Nicola continues to uncover fascinating stories that lie hidden in our everyday lives. Alongside her remarkable writing, Nicola is the co-host of the award-winning Gastropod podcast, which deals with food from a scientific and historical perspective. Today, we have the privilege of having Nicola give us an insight into the nearly invisible yet omnipresent world of the artificial cryosphere. And after the lecture, we will also have the opportunity to discuss the questions that immediately arise when delving deeper into this subject. So please join me in welcoming Nicola Twilley.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for being here. And thank you to Cult Cryo for finally giving me company in my enthusiasm for all things chilled. All right, so I'm very excited to be talking to you all, but I'm especially excited to be doing it here because this is basically the best location in the world to begin a journey through the artificial cryosphere. Everyone likes a cold beer, but, you might thank your fridge even for the cold beer at the end of a long, hot day. But what you probably don't realize is that you have beer to thank for having a fridge in the first place. So let me explain. I'm going to start by asking you to picture Earth's icy places. So, glaciers, permafrost, obviously the poles, these are Earth's frozen places, and the scientific name for this is the cryosphere, as you all know. It's out there. Now, though, picture your fridge. Hopefully it doesn't look like this. Hopefully, white stainless steel, clean, maybe messy, I don't know, maybe empty, maybe full. Regardless, your fridge is the tip of the iceberg because it is connected to this entire network of thermal control. If you live in the developed world, I have done the calculations, and nearly 3/4 of everything you eat passes through the cold chain at some point on its journey from the farm to the table. So that includes things you don't store in the fridge at home, like peanut butter. It gets stored in refrigerated warehouses, as well as the things you would imagine, like milk and so on. But this fridge as the tip of the iceberg, I realized about 15 years ago, I had never stepped inside this artificial cryosphere we'd built for our food to live in. And it's you add it all together, refrigerated warehouses, shipping containers, the trucks, the specialized architectures of banana ripening rooms and meat lockers. As far as best I can calculate, this adds up to more than 700 million cubic meters. So yeah, it's an artificial cryosphere. It's I think a third pole, and a new Arctic. And unlike the actual Arctic, it's growing fast. The old Arctic is not, but all over the world, people are joining the cold chain. It's expanding. So even though I made my living thinking and writing about food, and I had done for a decade at that point, I realized I've never stepped inside this entire invisible winter we've built for our food to live in. At the time, and this is going back some years, farm to table was new and exciting, and all the restaurants were advertising themselves as farm to table. And Alice Waters in the U.S. was talking about Michelle Obama was planting a vegetable garden with her. It was this time of like, where's our food coming from? And everyone was talking about farm to table, and I was like, but what about the two? That's what happens in the cold chain. So I decided to put on my thermal underwear, and like, Shackleton or Scott, I set out to explore this third pole. That involved working in a refrigerated warehouse. This is what happens after you take your hat off in the static electricity. It involved having my refrigerator analyzed by a refrigerator dating expert, and that is not my fridge. Or maybe it is. I'm not telling. It involved visiting so many refrigerated warehouses. This one is in a former limestone mine underneath Missouri, where Kraft, the makers of something that is called in America cheese, store their reserve. I visited the labs that test the thermal protection that the clothing that refrigerated warehouse workers wear is tested. And then I traveled all over the world. So from the fridge that protects the world's food supply in Svalbard to sub-Saharan Africa, where there almost is no cold chain, to China, where this is a country that, in typical Chinese style, built a cold chain overnight. And then I realized that I wanted to, all of this added together into the book. It's like a travelogue, but also, I think, a detective story, where I look at how domesticated cold ended up shaping everything. Everything from your gut microbes, to the clothes you wear, to the cities we live in, to the atmosphere we breathe. So, things you can trace back the invention of the cheeseburger to refrigeration, the invention of the hoodie, the protective gear for refrigerated warehouse workers originally, Irish independence, for real, Central American dictatorships, all of these things. You can find the fingerprints of refrigeration everywhere once you start looking. So these stories and many more are in the book, but this evening I wanted to focus on this bigger picture of how we came to adopt refrigeration and how that has transformed what we eat, where it's grown, what it tastes like, and how good it is for us and the planet, as well as the very meaning of freshness. So the first thing to bear in mind, and I think this is easy to forget, but today refrigeration is essential, it's ubiquitous, and so it's taken for granted. But it's a really recent introduction to our lives. So we have been able to add heat to food since before we were modern humans. This is like before modern humans evolved. We've been adding heat to our food. Some say this is how modern humans evolved, by being able to cook food and release the calories, give us this enormous brain. But cold is much, much more recent. The ability to take heat away from food, to make it cold, that only goes back 150 years. So for most of human history, and still today in most of the world, we have fed ourselves without a need for refrigeration. That's not because humans didn't realize that cold would help preserve their food. They weren't stupid. It's that natural cold is so fleeting and so ephemeral that people used it for pleasure rather than like the serious business of feeding ourselves. So it was for oysters and chilled wine in ancient Rome, and for ice cream parties in Medici, Italy, in the 1600s. Cold was something frivolous. And in fact, when a Scottish doctor in 1750 figured out for the first time how to make ice using a vacuum flask of ether and water and sort of this recently new thinking on gases and volumes and pressure, it was just a party trick. He published a pamphlet about something else and put this little experiment at the end as sort of a like, hey, look at this. Everyone ignored it for 100 years. It was nothing like, when you think about the revolution that taming fire was, the first person to make ice was like more of a fizzle than a spark. But this brings us back to brewing, because it was brewers that were the first to be interested in the possibility of using artificial cold to see its true potential. We had the ability to make ice, we didn't know what to do with it. It took brewers and beer to kind of catalyze that in humanity's mind. So without going into the whole history of beer, the shorthand version is that in the 1500s, brewers in Bavaria actually started using a different yeast that preferred cool temperatures. And at the time that was fine, because in Europe there was still the sort of legacy of the medieval Little Ice Age, and so temperatures were actually quite a bit lower than they are today, and they were able to use this bottom-feeding yeast rather than a top-feeding yeast that liked cooler temperatures without a problem. By the 1800s, this yeast had hybridized to become what is the ancestor of all modern lager varieties, so super successful yeast. Really had won the battle of the yeasts. But also Europe had warmed up. And so now you could make your beer in the spring, in the autumn, in the winter. You could not make summer was a real problem for brewers, and yet people wanted to drink beer in the summer, especially this delicious, refreshing lager. So brewers start digging these rock cellars underneath the breweries and then planting shady trees over top to add an extra layer of cooling. So that's the invention of the beer garden. And they use that natural means to brew in the cold. But, high summer was still a challenge, especially once lots and lots of Germans emigrated to the United States, in the southern United States, where temperatures were even warmer. So you have these Germans living in Missouri, and how are they supposed to get lager in the summer? Something of a catastrophe. So, which at this point, and this is the whole story of natural ice. Someone steps to the rescue. We heard this story today. Stefan told us about this Frederick Tudor, this high school dropout from Boston, whose family had a natural ice house, again for like chilled drinks in the summer, and who had this completely harebrained scheme that he came up with after going to Cuba with his brother and being too hot. Because he was from New England and he wasn't, adjusted to tropical temperatures. And he was like, oh, if only these people could, experience the pleasure of an iced drink, I could make a fortune. And promptly went into business without thinking through any of the, how do you ship ice around? What's the business model? What are these people in Cuba going to do with ice when they've never seen it and they have nowhere to store it and it's going to melt? All of this. Amazingly, despite kind of being I don't know, he went bankrupt like 3 times. If you go and see his notebooks, they're amazing because they're just filled with these miniature pep talks to himself where he's like, you can still get out. There's time to like turn your life around and do something different. But he made it work. And it wasn't until Frederick Tudor demonstrated that once you could harness cold at scale, it wasn't just for parties and for fun. It was for making food global. That then engineers revisited this Scottish doctor's party trick and started developing machines to make ice. And it was actually an Australian who was the first to sell a machine for making ice, and he sold it to both the first 2 machines were sold to breweries, one in London and one in Australia. So it's really beer that we have to thank. And even after that, it was the breweries that invested. At first, the machines were just used to make ice, and the ice cooled the space because that's what we are used to. But then the brewers were like, we could use these machines to cool water in a loop through the beer. And then they were like, well, what the heck? We could just use it to cool the air and make essentially a giant refrigerated space. So it really all comes out of brewers and all comes back to beer. And what I love about this is, there's this theory that it's actually wanting to make beer that motivated hunter-gatherers to sort of settle down and abandon their life of glorious freedom for like the harsh, nightmarish work of trying to coax grain out of the ground. It's because beer was the end result. Well, hey, if our lust for lager is the reason we have refrigeration, then we have 2 technologies that completely transformed everything we eat and really our relationship with the planet, fueled by our desire for intoxication. So why does this matter? Of course, we know the adoption of farming changed everything about our health and how we live and how we organize society and, the environment. But refrigeration is the same. It just hasn't received the same analysis, the same awareness, the same sort of accounting. And it's typically, honestly, still today seen as progress, like just plain and simple, unquestioned, like we moved forward. But it's a technology. It's the same as smartphones and AI. It can't be all good or all bad. And of course it has had costs as well as benefits. And so that's why I wrote this book, that accounting that I thought needed to happen. So I started working on it. So big picture, I think what is important about understanding refrigeration is that right now, artificial cold is sort of it's a key ingredient in the construction of a food system that prioritizes convenience and abundance and profit over public health or planetary boundaries. Like, that is something that is not an inevitable result of refrigeration, but it is enabled by refrigeration. In other words, refrigeration is essential to the food system we have, but a refrigerated food system doesn't have to look like this. And so I think if you understand what role refrigeration is playing and why it's being used the way it is, you have just given yourself one of the most powerful levers possible to reimagine our food system. And that is something that really needs to be fixed. I think, we can all agree. So I think it's a really important piece of research. And, from the sort of findings about the costs of refrigeration in my book, I think I would already say, listen, it's past time to rethink our relationship with refrigeration. But actually, as it turns out, it's really not optional to rethink our relationship with refrigeration, because cooling our artificial cryosphere is melting the natural one. And this is news to most people, not to most of you, but cooling food, just food, is already between 2.5 and 3% of global emissions is the latest estimate. So That's just food. That's not data centers or, buildings or any of the other things we keep cold. And of course, it's also, if it's 3%, it's more than global aviation, which you hear all the time, like I shouldn't be flying, should I be flying? No one's like, oh, should we be refrigerating? No. The other thing that is important to know about the artificial cryosphere is, like I said, it is expanding and rapidly. And that is happening even in places like the United States. It's the most refrigerated country in the world. It's still on track to have half as much refrigerated space alone, again, just for food, in the coming decade. So we're still building in the US, but meanwhile, in the developing world, the projection is that it will, if the developing world was to build, even a US-style cold chain, the emissions from that cold chain would multiply by 5. And that doesn't, if those emissions multiply by 5, then they are the same as, the emissions from the entire United States right now, which is unimaginably huge. So that calculation also doesn't take into account the fact that, 2 billion people are supposed to join our population over the next decade, and those people are majority going to be in sub-Saharan Africa, where a cold chain doesn't currently exist. So you're building for them too. Plus, for every half a degree Celsius, sorry, I live in the past. For every half a degree Celsius warmer it gets, a fridge uses 2% more energy, which doesn't sound a lot until you think that a fridge in a 32-degree room is using between 45 and 50% more energy than one in a 21-degree room. So the hotter it gets, the more energy we have to use to cool, and the hotter it gets. And it's just this incredibly dangerous and damaging cycle that hasn't been on people's radar. It's something the world is waking up to. And I'll give you a personal story. When I wrote about China's cold chain and how this country was, racing to refrigerate overnight and what difference it made, I wrote about a feature article for the New York Times Magazine. And when you're done and it's gone through editing, you have to be fact-checked. And so you give the fact-checker all your data and the annotations about emissions and where it's coming from and what that means. And my fact-checker, who was great, and this is 2014, so just a little more than a decade ago, she was like, your numbers are all correct, the citations are correct, this is obviously right, but I don't understand if it's this big of a deal, why haven't I heard about it? And I was like, well, but it's still true. Here we are more than a decade later, and I just gave a talk at a TED talk at their big climate event. Al Gore is headlining, blah, blah, blah. No one. Refrigeration was on no one's radar. Cooling was on no one's radar. I gave my lonely little talk, and everyone was like, huh, who knew? So this is still completely under the radar. And having this as a huge blind spot is a really big mistake, because it's actually, yes, it's a big disaster, but it's also a big opportunity, because most of this cold chain hasn't been built yet. And this is why the urgency of this is really the moment to rethink our relationship with refrigeration. And then people are like, oh, what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, so there are lots of ways we might do that. We might change how we refrigerate, the technology itself. And there's lots of exciting options there we can talk about. We might change how we fund research into refrigeration. Even on the technological side, that's less than 1% of global R&D right now. So we're throwing money at AI, for example, and nothing at how we cool. That doesn't seem like the right proportion. And we can, again, come back to that in conversation. But for now, I want to tell you a story about why actually rethinking our relationship with refrigeration is about much more than just technological innovation and what tech we use. So I'll start with this, which is my favorite image in the whole of refrigeration history. And so it might not look like much, but it is a menu from a banquet held in 1911 in Chicago, very fancy hotel. I found it while I was browsing an issue of Ice and Refrigeration, which was the industry journal at the time. I was looking for something else and just came across this write-up. And when I first saw it, I thought, this is amazing, because what you see here is that underneath each item on the menu, it says where it's been stored. And in fact, the speakers at the dinner also said how long things had spent there. So, the turkey had spent, 11 months in storage. And the apples, even though this was October and it was prime apple season, the apples had spent a year in Booth's cold storage. But what I loved about this is, this at the time when I discovered this, menus were just starting to say, oh, this comes from this farm, and it's, raised by this, practically had a picture of the farmer on it. And I was like, here's a menu that says which refrigerated warehouse it comes from. You don't see that on, foodie menus. And I was like, this is amazing. It must be because they're so proud of this exciting, futuristic new technology that they want to show off, right? This is like a status symbol. Look at our menu. It comes from all these refrigerated warehouses. And then I read more about this meal and the speeches that were made there and the newspaper articles that were written about it, because it was a big deal of senators, it was on the front page of newspapers across America at the time. And I realized, no, I have this completely backwards. This is not a proud menu. This is like panic PR. They're like crisis managing refrigeration, because the whole menu was designed to show that you could eat a meal where everything had been refrigerated and you wouldn't die. That's everyone sat down to the meal, and the idea is okay, we're going to show them. You can eat a refrigerated meal and survive. Because at the time, people genuinely thought that this might kill you. It just sounds so surreal, but even the speeches at the time, they're praising the bravery of the diners for being willing to do this. And there was an op-ed in the Journal of the American Medical Association being no, we can't take these kinds of risks, and it's just this was a true belief. And then when I thought about it, I was like, oh, well, it makes sense, of course, because up until refrigeration, we knew that freshness, that whether food was good or not, was bounded by what the geographer Alexander Friedrich calls a known physics of freshness, a known geography and a known temporality. It could only be from a certain distance and have been harvested a certain amount of time ago. And on this menu, that chicken could be 2 days old or it could be 2 years old, and you would have no idea. So it's not surprising that people were suspicious. And actually, I should say this was the chicken egg and dairy board, I think they were called, or marketing group or whatever. They are the ones who held this, and it was an example of actually industry trying to get out ahead of regulation, because at the time, Congress was considering very strict limits on how long food could be stored. They were 48 hours, for example, for a chicken was going to be the maximum. And the industry was like, oh, no. Especially back then when a train from Chicago to New York would take that amount of time, we can't have 48 hours be the maximum. That will cripple us. And so this menu was sort of an attempt to sort of end run around regulation. And it's what this shows us, I think, is, at the time, of course, there was a very different definition of freshness. This food wasn't rotten. People could tell it wasn't rotten, but they knew it wasn't fresh. It was something else. The fact that at the time the refrigerated meat trade was called the dead meat trade. It's but it's not alive when you eat it anyway. But this was understood to be a different category. It's not, with less alive somehow, more dead. And so what's so interesting about this is it's flipped 180 degrees. You know, today, especially in the United States, if something hasn't been refrigerated, it can't be fresh. And if it doesn't need to be refrigerated, if it's not perishable, it can't be fresh. So you have freshness, this quality that used to be kind of bounded by time and seasonality and geography. Now it's determined by association. Like, if it has to be refrigerated, then it's fresh, and thus refrigerated food sort of is by definition fresh. And this has then sort of influenced really weird things, such as when Silk soy milk was introduced, and this is one of the leading brands of soy milk in the US, also in the UK, I don't know here, maybe, anyway. It was introduced in the 70s. At the time, soy milk was available, but it was shelf stable, and it was sold in like hippie stores, and people, normal people never would have touched that. Like really, it was, you know, and regularly came at the top of like most hated food in America. And the founder of Silk was like, you know what? I think the thing is people don't think of it as milk, because milk has to be refrigerated. Milk is this perishable, fragile goodness. And soy milk is this horrible, shelf-stable, like, you know, goop. If I put my soy milk in the fridge, if I pay extra, again, this is the custom in America, if you want to be slotted in the refrigerated section, you're paying more, because the supermarket, you know, you're paying slotting fees for that position. If you don't, so they don't, Silk doesn't need to be there, it paid supermarkets to be there. And soy milk took off, it worked. So it's a really, really odd sort of phenomenon. I'll give you another more recent example. I was talking to an Australian meat industry consultant about a new technology that uses supercritical carbon dioxide to preserve meat. It will keep meat good at room temperature for 6 months plus, which is nuts. Even hearing that, I'm like, really? No. But yes. And he was like, this is a game changer for the Australian meat industry. At the moment, they can't, for example, the Middle East is a huge market for, you know, top grade Australian meat, but shipping it in shipping containers, you can't keep it fresh for that long, so then it either has to be air freighted, then it's too expensive, and so but frozen doesn't get the same price, and so they were like, we could use this technology and open up a whole market. But this meat consultant said to me, the industry consultant, he was like, but we'll still sell it out of the refrigerated container. We're not going to sell it from the shelf, because people would be way too freaked out to buy it if it was just sitting on the shelf. And I think that, you know, meanwhile, what's so amazing is then when I was traveling in sub-Saharan Africa, the market traders told me that when they get food that has been prepared for export, so the thinking is it's going to be flown to Europe for sale, so it's refrigerated, but then it fails quality control, so it has to be sold on the local market instead, you know, Tesco's or Sainsbury's or whatever, they don't want it. They've rejected it, so okay. The traders tell me they have to sit it outside until it loses the fridge cold to be able to sell it to locals, because otherwise locals are like, well, it's not fresh. So the same attitude that the US had 100 years ago, that is still the attitude in places without a cold chain. And to see that huge flip is kind of incredible. What's also interesting, though, is that even in the US, where, you know, refrigerated means fresh, and people like to live in blissful ignorance of everything to do with the food supply chain, I mean, or how old their food is. Like when I tell Americans, for example, who are eating an apple in July, I say, listen, this apple is like nearly a year old. And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, when are apples in season? Think about this. If it's an American apple, do you think they bred a special apple tree that gives apples in the spring? No, it's been in storage, and they're shocked. So there's a sort of willed ignorance as well. But even in the US, where, you know, refrigeration is taken for granted and thought to be the key to safety, there's still traces of a lingering residual uncertainty and mistrust about industrial freshness. And so I think this is really interesting. You know, pre-refrigeration, okay, you probably knew, you know, where your food came from and maybe even who produced it, but you also had confidence in your own ability to judge that, right? That you weren't going to be fooled. You were going to be able to tell if something was rotten. You had the sensory tools to do that. You could squeeze, you could smell, you could look. For consumers at the end of a cold extended food chain, you don't have that knowledge anymore, but you also don't have that confidence in your sensory beliefs. And freshness has become almost like something you have to trust. You have to take on faith. And like all religions, then, well, you know, the believers, they need a sign. And what is that sign? That sign is a best before date, a use by date, an expiry date. And I hate to say it, guys, but beer, once again, was the first thing. It's all comes back to beer. Beer started printing freshness dates in the 1930s. So using it to advertise the freshness of their product and let people know. But the food was, you know, as always, behind. Of course, producers knew how old their food product was, and they had to have ways of tracking that. So they developed their own systems of alphanumeric codes. This is a soup can, obviously not refrigerated, but they would have their own inventory management systems, a series of like letters and numbers, all different depending on the producer and the supermarket, and they all meant slightly different things. So some were indicating when it was harvested or produced, some were indicating when it was going to go bad, some were indicating when it should be, you know, sold by, when it should be discounted by, all of those things, all meant different things. And customers could see these codes, but they couldn't understand them. And it fed into this sense that there was something they didn't know about freshness, that they needed to, you know, the uncertainty of not being able, knowing there's information about freshness that you can't access. And you could see these moments where this sort of craving to know if something is fresh kind of bubbles to the surface. So in the 1960s in the UK, Marks and Spencer's, they introduced this pre-sliced cherry cake, which you can weirdly still buy today. And they had a system where if it was wrapped in purple film plastic, it was sliced on Monday. And if it was wrapped in red, it was sliced on Tuesday. And the whole system for the days of the week. And customers were like, why is my cake coming in different color wrappers? Like, it was driving them bananas. And so Marks and Spencer's had to introduce a little shelf label explaining what this meant in terms of freshness. This image actually comes from a booklet published by the New York State Consumer Protection Board in 1977, and it's called, this booklet was called Blind Dates, How to Break the Codes on the Foods You Buy. So they had gone through and done their research to decipher all these proprietary manufacturer and producer and supermarket codes, and they printed it all out in this book. And, you know, it was like a consumer bureau. It's not like a big public event. They sent one to the local paper. Within a week, they had more than 14,000 requests for this booklet that they were sending out for you. Practically bankrupted them sending it out. So that goes to show the sort of level of uncertainty. And once again, you know, there's this public unhappiness, and so government starts thinking, what should we do? What should we do? And they're discussing, you know, regulation that will require producers and supermarkets to label how old food really is. And industry is like, oh no, we actually don't want you to know that. And so they sidestep that minefield with a voluntary system of best before, use by, sell by, which has this sort of handy effect of, distracting you from how old it actually is. And so, yes, in Marks and Spencer's actually took the lead here again. Their food division used to be called St. Michael. I don't feel like they go with that anymore. But they took the lead here again. They hired Twiggy, the supermodel, to do a whole advertising campaign, repositioning their internal kind of inventory management tool as a guarantee that their foods were fresh. So yeah, this actually was my sandwich that I ate on the way to Darmstadt. And I like that you have to pull to release the freshness. So and it's freshly prepared, obviously, and it has a use by date. So it really has all the certainty that even the most doubtful believer could require. But as you kind of probably all know, today the system is still a total mess. There's a lot of confusion about the difference between best before, which is to do with quality, and use by, which is supposed to be to do with safety. In the US, it's even more of a mess. There is no federal standard on food date labeling, except for baby formula. That's the only thing they regulate. So everything is left up to the state level, and states have different rules. So for example, milk in Montana will expire a full week before it would expire anywhere else in the US. It's like, well, that's obviously just either there's something very interesting happening in Montana or it's not true. You know, and even within, if you understand that like use by is for safety, even so, the fact of the matter is these dates are calculated by manufacturers and producers. So they're coming from them, and they're done with an eye towards protecting themselves. So it's basically an educated guess with a lot of padding. And it has to have a lot of padding because they're like, we don't know what you're going to do with it. Did you actually keep it out of the fridge for like 4 hours while you went round to a friend and had a cup of tea? So they're not a precise measurement of freshness at all. What's more, there is no evidence that date labels help keep people safe. So there's a great natural experiment in the United States where 30 states don't have any regulation on date labeling, and there's no evidence that there's more food poisoning in those states than there are in the ones with food poisoning, which there should be. And then as intended, of course, there's this weird like day zero effect where it starts to be like, well, it sort of, because you now have a new date in your mind for the end of freshness, you forget about how old it actually is. It sort of elides the supply chain. And of course, the singular instance of a date is completely ridiculous because that is not how freshness works. So you think, oh, this is still, within date. It's been in my fridge for 2 weeks, but it hasn't, gone past its sell-by date, so it must still be good. And you don't think, well, over that 2 weeks, undoubtedly, like it's not like it's going bad all in one go. It's been gradually going bad. It's not what you bought. And so it gives this illusory sense that like the fridge preserves freshness intact, whereas in fact, for example, if you buy a bag of, spinach, it will lose half the vitamins and minerals that it had in it when you bought it by the end of the first week, but you're still eating it as if it's fresh spinach, just doesn't have the same nutrients. And then, of course, we know, like, the huge impact of this is actually that we throw away a ton of perfectly good food. 9 million tons in the EU, 11 million tons in the US. It's ridiculous. And then the final thing that I think this label does is and this confusion around freshness, is it affects how we might or might not refrigerate in future. And so this is my final story, but refrigeration preserves fruit and vegetables by slowing down how fast it breathes. That's how it works. It's slowing down the metabolism. So the fruit and vegetables has the same number of breaths it takes, but it takes them more slowly, so it dies, more slowly. So if you could control the metabolism of fruit and vegetables at room temperature, would those vegetables still be fresh? You'd be doing the exact same thing that you do when you put it in a fridge, but you'd be doing it at room temperature. And it's like, this is where we think about what the goal of refrigeration is, right? With beer, it is you do want your beer cold. But with a strawberry, you don't actually want your strawberry cold. You want your strawberry fresh. In fact, a strawberry is much nicer when it is not cold. So if you could keep it fresh without cold, that would be a win for both energy and flavor. And as it happens, fortunately, there is a technology that actually does preserve freshness at room temperature. So this is a coating called a peel. It's like a edible, lipid-based coating that you spray on produce, and it doesn't react with anything. It creates no new chemistry. It just forms what is called a differentially permeable membrane. That's the same thing every cell in your body has. It just lets in oxygen more slowly, lets carbon dioxide out at a different rate, changes the rate of humidity. All of that has the effect of changing how fast the fruit and vegetables breathe. So this actually is peppers and lemon at the Appeal, headquarters, and the ones on the right have been coated in a peel. The ones on the left are naked, and they've been left at room temperature for 8 weeks, which is kind of incredible. It sort of works. And, obviously there's lots of interesting implications about this. You can think about, it's also commercially available, I should say. So in the US, obviously it's used as a supplement to the cold chain because the cold chain is there and everyone uses the cold chain. So it's put on your cucumber so your cucumber lasts even longer in the fridge. Of course, in countries without a cold chain, it could be revolutionary. And, you could have smallholder farmers kind of spraying this on rather than needing to invest in a huge power-hungry cold chain. It could be incredible. But my point in telling the story tonight was to say, in terms of freshness, two things. One, how does this redefine freshness again? Now it doesn't have to be refrigerated. How do you know it's fresh? Well, the CEO of Appeal said, listen, I think freshness means if it has more of the chemicals, the nutrients, the flavors, the things we love, the phyto, nutrients, minerals, whatever. If it has more of the things that it had at the moment of harvest, then it is fresh. It's a chemical definition. It becomes something that is physiologically true that you can measure with instrumentation. How close is this to the moment it was harvested? So once again, refrigeration has changed its definition and changed how you could assess it. But also, totally fascinating, happened since my book came out, there has been this huge backlash about Appeal. And so, it was doing really well. It was in Whole Foods, it was in Walmart, it was everywhere. It was being used on everything. And then suddenly there's this online backlash from influencers saying, first of all, they don't want chemicals on their food. Fine, there are chemicals in your food. I hate to break it to you. It is chemicals. But also a much bigger problem that I think was really interesting, which is that they were like, why are they trying to sell us food that's this old? It's not fresh anymore. And so there's two things there. They didn't see this extended shelf life as fresh. Refrigeration as a technology to extend shelf life, that brings you freshness. This extended shelf life was just an artificial extended shelf life, not a fresh natural shelf life. So that was really interesting to me. Refrigerated freshness is natural. This is not. And then also beneath that, this interesting problem of how we redefine freshness, which is that most people don't actually realize that their food isn't freshly harvested anyway. There's such an effort being put into the pictures of the farm on the packaging and the supermarket spraying the moist drops so it looks like freshly kissed by the dew in the morning. And there's this whole kind of illusory, and you want to believe it too as a consumer, of course. So it's convenient to believe. And this is why when I tell people that their apples are 11 months old, they're so horrified, whereas if you literally thought about it for 1 second, you could figure that out, is because there's a collaborative, suspended willingness not to know about the supply chain. and what it takes to bring us fresh food. And that is why I think it's going to be so hard to rethink freshness for maybe not a post-refrigeration age, but an age where we don't only rely on that, because people have such firm beliefs. And so, yeah, I think, I'll bring it to an end here, but I think that this sort of refrigeration's ability to kind of obscure foods, our actual understanding of food's seasonality, its value, its freshness, whether it will be good for us, that has actually done more, has had a bigger cultural impact than any other aspect of it. And when we rethink our relationship with refrigeration, we're going to have to rethink a lot of our attitudes as well. Thank you.
So, yes, thank you so much for sharing, a lot of pieces of, this decade of research you have done on this topic so far. And, it's more than almost 2 decades.
Yes, it's like 15 years. I was telling people I'd been working on it for a decade, and then I actually calculated, and I was like, 15 years. Even longer.
And I have been engaged with this topic for only 1 decade. But I frequently received the question, how did you come up with this topic? So, and I'm now delighted to finally have the chance to ask this question to someone whose work has inspired my own research as well. So, what initially sparked your interest in this artificial cryosphere, or the third pole, as you have referred to?
So part of it really was like it was this time of farm to table, and there were great books being written about that and offering people like a peek behind the food system, and it was the first time people were writing about CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, and like this really like an invisible kind of world behind our food. And I was so jealous of these people having written these books that I wished I had written myself, because they're kind of books where you're just like underlining everything, and you're just I was both enjoying it and hating it, because it was the book I would have wished to have written myself, because I was already writing about food and geography and these invisible geographies, and I was like, that I had to find my own way into that, and that's where the thinking about the two came in. And then also I was actually my husband was doing a residency at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and they were doing an exhibition on military architecture, I think it was. Anyway, there was one of the curators had an ideas board, and it was about architecture of the rear. And I was like, what would that mean for food? What is the architecture of the? If you think the architecture of the front is maybe the supermarket, like that's what supermarket design is. What's the architecture of the rear? What are those buildings? And so that I just started out being like, I should go and look at some refrigerated warehouses, and then down a rabbit hole.
Down the rabbit hole, yeah. it's a rabbit hole. So, and now you have spent all these years researching across all the places of the whole planet. I found it interesting that, for one part, in history, we can see this sort of early resistance against this new technology, like, this is not fresh, and then you have shown this menu, which purpose was to prove that it's reliable and healthy food, and you would not die from it, and so on. And in your book, there are also several examples now from contemporary contexts that in places where the cold chain is not present yet, but starts to emerge or be built, there you can find also these kind of gestures or expressions of resistance, like like this Chinese cook who says these frozen dumplings that have become so popular now in China, this is not real food, or this is not food at all,
Yeah.
and also in other places. And but then you also highlighted and showed in different contexts that at some point the whole story flips, and then everybody embraces the artificial cold. And if you look at it this way, through history and in different parts of the world, it looks like an irresistible movement or development of technology, or a sort of like a human desire, like an anthropological factor or whatever. It looks like that, but maybe it isn't like that. So what do you think of this strange dynamics that can be observed so often in different cultural contexts, that in most cases seem to have only one direction in the end?
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and it still happens. I was talking about my book with a foreign exchange student at MIT who was like, why does all American food taste so dead? And, it's like this, if you're not used to this flavor, if you're not used to how refrigerated food is, you don't think it's fresh, and yet people adopt it. And I think, honestly, money has a big part to do with that, and primarily price. Because the one thing that refrigeration does is it has this tendency towards scale and efficiency, and this is why industry adopts it, it makes them money. So when refrigeration was introduced, to the meat industry, it was to make money, because you suddenly didn't have to ship the whole cow, half of which is not edible anyway. And so you're saving a huge amount on shipping, and you're able to monetize all the byproducts because you're able to slaughter in one place rather than ship the live animal and have just village butchers everywhere slaughter. Now you're slaughtering in one place. Well, now you have all that blood and all that fat and all that bone in one place, so it's worth doing something with. And so it just became it's implemented for money, but then adopted by customers for money reasons too, because the producers are now making so much money they can sell their meat for less. So the price of a steak in New York, after a Chicago dressed, beefs, like there was a time in New York City where you could still buy live meat and you could buy this dead meat, and the dead meat was cheaper. And guess what? People who were like, ooh, it's dead meat, I'm a little squeamish. Well, you sell it to them for half price. They often come around. So I think a big part of why it seems so irresistible is because it's cheaper.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Question of economy.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking about economy, you also collected a list of very interesting numbers regarding, for example, the energy demand and also the food waste. And when it comes to food waste, it's also a two-sided story. Like there's this food waste produced by using artificial cold, and the amount of food waste that could be prevented by using artificial cold. And would you say there could be a reasonable direction to deal with food waste in a right way by using artificial cold? So is there a wrong way, a good way? What would you say about this?
Yeah, it's really interesting because oftentimes people who, like at the UN or like Gates Foundation or whatever, they want to implement refrigeration, it is to prevent food waste. And obviously, preventing food waste is really important. We all know that if, food waste was a country, its emissions would be the size of China or something. It's incredible how much And that's, before you take into account all the water you've wasted, that is, and all the land you've, deprived of biodiversity and so on. So food waste is disastrous environmentally on many, many levels. So eliminating it would indeed be great. And if artificial refrigeration did that, we should, embrace it wholeheartedly and just figure out the emissions later. But what is interesting is that refrigeration gets rid of what they call food loss, which is food that is wasted between the farm and the market. And it seems to shift where that takes place to the consumer end. So before the US had a cold chain, 30+% of all the food that the United States grew rotted before it made it to market. Okay, so now those losses are really small. I mean, they still exist, but they're statistically insignificant. Now, though, Americans throw away 30% of everything that makes it to market. So the food wasted was not decreased. It was just where it takes place shifts. And what I was really interested in when I went to China, which is the country that has, really recently built a cold chain, is that is happening right now. They had huge food wastage. You can see the statistics. They had huge food wastage between farm and market, as everyone had moved to cities, and there was this not a system to get food to them, very urbanized, again, sort of in a hurry, and enormous amounts of food being wasted. And now it's actually being wasted at the consumer level. And so I think what's so interesting about that is okay, so then what to do with that information? Well, the problem with the way that we use refrigeration at the consumer level is to give this sense of endless abundance, right? You go to the supermarket, you can always find more of everything. And consumers have this sense of if it goes bad, I'll buy more. It doesn't matter. It's cheap, it's convenient, it's abundant, You don't have to worry. None of us are torn up if we have to throw away something from our fridge, And so the way that refrigeration has sort of encouraged food waste at the consumer end, I don't think has to be, it's not built into refrigeration, the attitude, it's just how it's been used by the grocery, the supermarkets. It's the attitude that has prevailed in giving us very cheap, very abundant food and making us think that there's no work involved in getting it to us. So I don't know. Could you imagine a system where refrigeration is used from the farm to the market, but somehow either attitudes are shifted after it, or we do something different? There's a saying in the book from a Canadian architect, which is small fridges make good cities, and good cities only require small fridges. And I think this is true. Everyone knows if you have a smaller fridge, you waste less food, because you shop more frequently and you're not planning for a meal that doesn't actually end up happening because your plans changed, etc. And so there's also something there about how we use refrigeration on the consumer end in such a way that doesn't promise this endless abundance. But anyway, that's a long answer. But when you have a giant hypermarket filled with everything and then a giant fridge at home, wastage occurs, but no one says that a fridge has to be giant,
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe so if we relate this problem, which seems to be a story of everyday behavior of consumers, to the answer you gave to the question before, so it's a question of economy, then you can say, okay, you could even save money by behaving more reasonable.
If you were charged for the food you threw away, that would change very quickly. That would be a super easy way to do it.
But could you also imagine that it might be that this strange behavior is not only related to a sort of lack of knowledge or consciousness, like a sort of unconscious behavior, but it is related to what you already mentioned, this feeling or presence of abundance. Yeah. Maybe that's also important as well. So, okay, it's cheap, but it's not only cheap. It's also now this abundance, and maybe it's even important to throw things away. So because it also is part of the perception, feeling of abundance as well.
Yeah.
Like this waste as sort of not intended, but embraced somehow.
Yes, I think that part is really true too, and it's really interesting. You know, again, when I started writing this book a long time ago, and people were talking all about like urban farming. Urban farming is going to feed the future, blah blah blah, and then lots of people were like, no, it's not. You can't feed a city from some nice vertical farms and rooftop gardens and whatever. It's not going to happen. It's ridiculous. And what was interesting about that discourse was then people were like, urban farming is pointless. But one of the experiments that one of the refrigeration experts I interviewed for my book talked about was how she had done this urban farming experiment and then measured food waste at the end of it. So not like, we're going to feed ourselves, this is how to reduce food miles, but like just, okay, how does this change your attitude towards food? Like how does realizing how much work goes in to growing a lettuce, and also when a lettuce is in season, and how, great a fresh lettuce tastes, and all of these things that you know when you actually have a relationship with food as it comes out of the ground. Those things, the people in her study, they didn't cut down their food miles, blah, blah, blah. They cut down their food waste, like dramatically. And so I do think there's a sense of, it's because we don't know, there's no value in the broccoli. It's just broccoli. Whereas once you've grown some broccoli, you're actually kind of in awe of the work it takes. I mean, anyone who's tried to grow food then you realize, oh, thank God there are farmers who can grow this stuff for us. So it's it rewards your soul, but you aren't going to feed yourself that way. But I think what it does do is it tells you the value, and so I think that point to your point, that shift revealed that it's actually it is refrigeration has this kind of disposability attitude built in, and you can counteract that by a process that reminds people of what has to happen before the supermarket, which refrigeration otherwise makes invisible.
So you would plead for sort of education or awareness building, let's open the discussion to the audience. I would ask a last question regarding the future, the possible future of refrigeration, and you already presented this technology of this organic coating. Can you imagine this can help to change the fate of the cryosphere? I mean, the title of your book is Frostbite, and frostbite is this sort of damage that's being done by freezing food. So it's already indicating that you might see our relationship to artificial code as damaged somehow, and it needs some refreshment or repair or new direction. So can you also imagine further alternative technologies or practices beyond this organic coating, maybe different practices or I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, first of all, I should say, I am not against fridges. I have a fridge. I love my fridge. I think refrigeration has a role to play in the future of any food system. I definitely do not try to picture a future without it. The question I have right now is it's like humans have been trying to work out how to stop food from going bad since the dawn of time. And a lot of our most delicious foods come out of that struggle, cheese, if you like sauerkraut, here we are in Germany, like very, very, very many delicious things. Flavors, salty, smoky, spicy flavors, sour, pungent, they come from this attempt to keep food good. Then refrigeration came along and everyone was like, great, we're done. let's stop thinking about this. And I guess my thought is like, why is this the end? Why is this the best? We know, for example, that, we were just looking at mangoes at the Perishable Center in Frankfurt. Like, you can't refrigerate really good mangoes. That's why we don't have them in supermarkets. We have terrible mangoes in supermarkets that taste like nothing. And that's why, people who move here from countries where mangoes are like beautiful, like they'll have a supermarket mango and be like, what is this? It's just not the same. And I think, again, anyone who's had like fresh tomato off the vine in the summer, they know, like, when you buy the Dutch ones in the middle of winter, they are not the same. And it's not just how they're grown, it's refrigeration. And so I think that it's possible, for example, that a spray like that, well, wow, if you could use that on a really great mango, and it would give you it, so the mango doesn't have to get cold, but it can still get preserved. This could make life more delicious and more sustainable. And so I would like to see a future where we are much less like, oh, it's perishable, we refrigerate that, to what is the right solution for the goal. Like, again, you want beer cold, you want a strawberry fresh. Maybe those two things take different tools. The company that I was talking about with the meat, their going to market strategy using this supercritical carbon dioxide is frozen French fries. So you won't have to put French fries in a freezer. It's a very clever strategy because they're going out to food service, and so they don't have to deal with customer expectations. Customers are not going to know that the fries are not in the freezer, because that's not, you don't go and look at the freezer in McDonald's, you just eat the fries. So it's really, really clever. It works really, really well, and it has the bonus effect of actually kind of the process. The carbon dioxide makes the fries a little crispier. So they even taste better. So my thinking is like, I hate to be American about it, but we could actually do better. It doesn't mean sacrifice, like we should use refrigeration when it makes sense, and we should make it more sustainable where we can, using technological innovation, but we shouldn't say this is how we preserve freshness, because and how we make food good and how we store it, because we've been able to do that in a bunch of different ways. So let's keep our minds open.
So thank you again very much for coming here into this ice cellar in Darmstadt,
yes.
And joining our discussions regarding the artificial cryosphere, which we have heard of. It's only one part of it. It's the food part. It's highly connected to all these different other domains, systems, and practices you just mentioned. In your answer to this question, is there anything more to tell about what? Yeah, it is. And we really hope that you are going to continue your research on the subject, and looking forward to your next works on it. But for today, we say thank you and
Thank you so much. I really think Cult Cryo is the coolest project out there. No pun intended. No, but it's just everything I dreamed of, happening on a much bigger scale and so much more thoughtful, and I love it.
Thanks.